for today's lecture in the archaeology of ancient Israel is to highlight contributions of leaders in the field of archaeology of the Levant who are contributing to our understanding of the archaeology of ancient Israel in the 21st century. As such, these lectures include a wide range of archaeologists who are fostering a robust dialogue between the archaeology of ancient Israel, Jewish studies, anthropology, history, and the sciences. In this regard, it is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Jennie Ebeling, Associate Professor of Archaeology at the University of Evansville in Indiana, and co-director of the Jezreel Expedition. She earned her doctorate in the archaeology of the Near East from the University of Arizona and specializes in the archaeology of Israel and Jordan. She is a former Fulbright scholar. As such, she has been awarded fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Lady Davis Trust for research into ancient food and drink technology and women in Canaan and ancient Israel. Her research interests include ancient food and drink technology, women in Canaan and ancient Israel, and the religion and cult in the Bronze and Iron Age Levant. And her publications include a number of recent books, and even in our course that was sort of reconfigured last spring and is in its second year this year, Archaeology, Identity, and the Bible, we are using one of these texts, the Old Testament in Archaeology and History, that was published in 2017, and I commend it to you as the most recent effort, and a wonderful one at that, to sort of update our understandings of the archaeology of Israel with many of the questions that we are entertaining these days in archaeology and identity studies. In addition to this, she's published Women's Lives in Biblical Times that came out in 2010, Household Archaeology in Ancient Israel and Beyond in 2011, and New Approaches to Old Stones, Recent Studies of Ground Stone Artifacts, one of her particular sort of going deep specialties, which was published in 2008. So we look forward to hearing about the results of her ongoing research in today's talk titled Feeding the Gods in Ancient Israel. Please welcome Jennie Ebeling.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burke, for inviting me to be here, and to the Levy Center and the other sponsors for bringing me out. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. So I wanted to go back to where all this, I guess, began, because I guess our research sort of kind of spins on and on and on without end, and so I was trying to look for the beginnings of this. And this actually took me back to graduate school. So when I was at the University of Arizona, I was kind of pushed in the direction of working on stone artifacts for a small site that had been excavated by my colleagues there. And that also, at the same time, I was working at Hatzor, which is in northern Israel, which you can see marked in red on both of those maps, with the Hebrew University excavation. So this was my first dig in Israel as a volunteer. And so my growing expertise in ground stone tools led me to analyze and then start to publish. I'm continuing to publish the large and fascinating groundstone artifact assemblage from Hatzor. So one of the things that I found when I was working on this as a student, and then after I finished my doctorate, and kind of in the years since, was evidence that they were making basalt bowls at Hatzor. And then I was finding these pieces, and I wasn't sure what they were, and I was pulling them out, and no one really could help me with it, so I was just sort of keeping them to the side. I found like 25 things that I thought were suspicious. But then in 2010, the excavators in Area M unearthed what appears to be the first basalt vessel workshop that's known from the Levant. It's in a 9th century context. This is in Area M at Hatzor, for those who are familiar. And the workshop is over here. And so in addition to the pieces that I pulled from all over the tell from the previous, 20 years of excavations, I guess, there were another 25 of these preforms or wasters that were found in this space alone, along with a couple of interesting installations and evidence for other technologies. So what you're looking at here are bowls that are in the process of being carved. And so this is like, a gold mine for people like me who are trying to understand not only the use, but also, the technology of the production of these sorts of things in antiquity. This one, for example, you can see the little mark in the center that they were trying to kind of keep the symmetry. And then I think it's most clearly seen on this example. On the left, this is a three-legged or tripod bowl that's in the process of being carved out. And there's one on the right that is what the finished product would look like in the end. So again, this is an ongoing project that's kind of getting me into kind of different sorts of issues and exchange of prestige items in the 9th century and other things. But also, when I got to Jezreel, which here's again I'm moving the red dots around. So in the Jezreel Valley here, where I started working with my colleague Dr. Norman Franklin in 2012. We were completely and totally floored by the incredible number of brownstone artifacts that were coming out of our excavation squares. So I just show you just to illustrate. And this is just totally a fluke that I happen to be the co-director of this project and we come up with all this basalt. Like I didn't plan for this to happen. And anyway, so like the first season, we needed to kind of have heavy machinery to move the stuff around and actually pull individual grinding stones out of the field and take them back to the kibbutz where we stay next door. And this is what it looks like every season as we're packing up the hundreds and even thousands of grinding stones and bowls and pestles and mortars and all kinds of stuff that we're excavating, so that we have now about 7 tons. And so this takes me to the stuff. So the stuff doesn't come to me to study at home in Indiana. So that's kind of nice because it keeps me going back, I guess. But so this is what I do over Christmas, and this is what I'll be doing next month with students for a few weeks, is continuing to measure and weigh and sort and have drawn and photographed and everything else, all the grinding stones here. And it's not perhaps such a surprise that we're finding that there is manufacture of basalt artifacts going on, because the site where we're working, which is below Tel Jezreel itself, it's next to the spring of Ein Israel, is on a basalt flow. And so the earliest settlers at the site, Wadi Rabba, so late Neolithic, apparently were actually founding the site on top of this exposed basalt flow, and later on, when we've got better architecture in the early Bronze 1, we actually have buildings that are constructed directly on basalt foundations. Over here on the right, you can see a couple of these wasters or preforms that we found just strewn around the site. So we found a number of them in context, but then a lot of them are also sort of on the surface, hanging around exposed basalt. So that's kind of moving me closer to sort of where I'm going with an understanding of what these things were used for. Most of the material I'm dealing with from Jezreel is coming from the early Bronze Age and before. So it doesn't have direct bearing on the topic of today, which is going to be the Iron Age. Here's some of the objects. So some really large in situ grinding stones, some of the earliest known in the Levant. Here's an upper grinding stone that would have been used along with this, perhaps, just a piece of mortar. We have more exotic, I guess, items and sort of prestige items in the form of these distinctive pillared stands, which are late Neolithic, Chalcolithic perhaps, as well as Chalcolithic fenestrated bowls, and then some sort of stele, interestingly. So we're still working on this and trying to look for parallels, and it's become very, very interesting. We're also doing a geochemical analysis and petrographic analysis of the basalt to see which ones are actually made out of Jezreel basalt. So basically taking artifact samples and samples from the landscape here, for example, this exposed outcrop, and comparing them. And we found so far that, not surprisingly, most of them are made out of our basalt, but not all. And also we're starting to get results from nearby sites like Megiddo of items made out of Jezreel basalt that were then traded to Megiddo in the Chalcolithic period. So stay tuned for that. So that's a completely different topic, but this is sort of my background in the study of groundstone artifacts and where I am in different projects. A related project I conducted in Jordan, so going over to the other side of the river here to the area southwest of Irbid in the north, I did a project in 2012 when I was a fellow at Acor in Amman, which had me go out to every museum and also through the Antiquities Authority's storerooms and record all of the rotary grinding stones that were in their collections. And then I was trying to create a typology of this. These things have not been carefully studied. This is a technology that was introduced into the Levant in the Roman period, so it's a very, very long-lasting technology. In my ethnographic work on ovens in northern Jordan, I actually encountered one set of rotary grinding stones that's still used by the family and by neighboring women from time to time. So that was really amazing. But what I was there also to accomplish was to record the manufacture and use of traditional clay ovens. They're called tabun or tababin in plural. I worked at, I think, 13 villages in northern Jordan during this award period and documented several dozen women who were making and using these things. And I also created a film with a filmmaker friend who's based in Jordan and a couple of videos that you can find online if you look around. So this has informed my understanding of other technologies related to cooking, or specifically in this case, baking. So for me, this is all kind of different resources for trying to understand how similar kind of practices may have worked in the past. So I'm pulling from not only some biblical references, which I'll get into in a bit, but primarily the archaeology as well as the iconographic record, and then ethnographic and ethnoarchaeological studies in the region to understand more about women's control of baking and other cooking activities in antiquity. So just to be clear, what I'm going to talk about then primarily today is our sites from the Iron Age 2, so from about 1000 to 586. I'm going to show one case study that seems to be in a late 10th century context, and then the other one, which is sort of the better case study, is from late 8th. So it's jumping around a little bit in time, but I'm trying to stick primarily to Judah for various reasons, as you'll see. So here's a lovely scene that comes out of King and Steger's book, Life in Biblical Israel. And this is a sort of scene of an extended family household, a compound that includes 2 of these pillared or 4-room houses. These examples have 2 stories, and then within a walled compound that was shared by this Beit Av, or extended family. The context for this picture is Iron 1, so it's a little bit earlier than the period I'm talking about. But what I like about this illustration, there's a lot I don't like about it, but what I like about it is because it's too clean and other things, but I do like that right in the foreground is what I would consider to be some of the most important activities that were being carried out in this household compound. So specifically, you've got an assembly line, looks like here, where we've got grinding on grinding stones. Here's the grain and the flour. Some grain, I imagine, is being processed in that mortar with a pestle. We've got dough being, kind of worked, kneaded, whatever, in order to make loaves that are then going to be baked in this tanur type oven, this upright oven. You've got a hearth over here with a cooking pot on it. You've got a kid hanging out on a mat nearby, and you've got women working together, and all this sort of stuff that we imagine might have been, what life was like during this time, within a situation where women might have spent up to several hours a day grinding grain to feed their families, the primary source of calories in ancient Israel, which was bread and other grain-based foods and drinks. So here are just a couple of examples of what some of the traditional breads may have looked like that were created and consumed in ancient Israel. So we've got biblical descriptions of bread being baked in embers, and so here is a documented example of this from my study in the Northeast Dead Sea area. And then here is a leavened bread loaf that's baked in a tanur type oven. That's obviously a contemporary oven. But this is the kind of bread that I have in mind when I'm thinking about what sort of bread and cakes and baked goods were the staple foods during the Iron Age in the Levant and basically everywhere else in that region as well. What do we have in terms of the specific evidence for the manufacture and consumption of bread and other grain-based foods? So I show you here a fantastically well-preserved grinding emplacement that's from 9th century Rehov in the Jordan Valley, excavated by Mazar, and this is one of several, and it consists of a lower grinding stone here that's tilted forward, and then an upper grinding stone or hand stone on top of it that was found nearby. I think this one was found in the bin itself. And then you've got this grinding, this sort of low wall or, sort of installation that is perhaps intended to keep the flour more contained and so it won't fly around and, kind of spread around. And then in order to use it, one would kneel behind the installation as is being demonstrated here, and then reach down and over it, and then the flour would, as it was being ground, it would come off the front and be collected. So we have, lots of artistic evidence from Egypt especially, going all the way back to the Old Kingdom period, like this example here, an Egyptian servant statue, which shows almost always women grinding grain using a traditional grinding stone set, similar to the one that we have from the Iron Age. In this case, they're usually shown flat, lying on the ground, but not always. So there are, perhaps various reasons why these grinding stone sets would be set up in different ways. But these help inform on this technology, of course, during the time. Even though it's still a rather understudied subject, we know a lot about the changes in grinding technology in the region through the millennia. So I just want to put this in here as a sort of brief introduction to what that looks like. So this type, the flat grinding slab and the upper mobile stone, the hand stone, we have these things going back to the Upper Paleolithic period in the region, before the grains that were later used to, that were later ground on these things were domesticated, so they were actually processing wild vegetal foods with these things. This technology, basically in this form, persists through the Iron Age. And then in the Persian period, we have the introduction of a new technology, which is the Olympus mill, which basically is a slight improvement, I guess, over this, in that the upper stone can actually be moved by inserting a rod and then moving the thing back and forth in a sort of lateral motion like this. This was a fairly short-lived technology. This one is actually from Pompeii itself, but those who've been to Israel and around that region have probably seen bits and pieces of these Roman or Pompeian mills all over the place, because they're found in great quantity on the landscape at Roman period sites. And so this is more kind of taking grinding of grain out of the household and commercializing it. So you'd find these kinds of grinding stones in commercial bakeries. The upper part would have been turned by humans or animals around this sort of base. And then sometime in the Roman period, the earliest examples we have in the Levant are from Masada. We have the rotary grinding stone that I showed you before. And so this form, this sort of rotary motion, returns to the domestic context and then continues to be used into the 21st century in this region. So it's a very long-lived technology. As you can perhaps make out, all of the stone here is similar. It's all basalt. It's all vesicular basalt with holes in it, basically. So this creates a sharper grinding surface for grinding grain and less grit than you would get in your flour than if you were grinding with sandstone or limestone tools. So contrary to what it seems like should be the case, that lots of junk is going to flake off and get into your flour, that actually has been shown through experiments to not happen with basalt. So this seems to be universally and cross-culturally in all times and places the most desirable material for grinding stones. And fortunately enough for us, especially in northern Israel, we've got abundant supply of it. Another technology, or another source, I guess, for a related technology is experiment. So here I show you a reconstructed oven that was built by my friends and colleagues working at Tel Halif, Cynthia Schaefer-Elliott, Tim Frank, and students. And so they built this tannoor-like oven in order to attempt to create something closer to what we think of as biblical bread. So it's an upright oven. The fire is, stoked from the bottom of the side, and then the bread is actually baked on the inside walls. Here is just a random archaeological example of what a similar type of oven looks like. These things, as well as grinding stones, are ubiquitous in Iron Age archaeological context in Israel. They're everywhere. They're not necessarily very well published, as we'll see, but they're found all over the place at every site, and they're abundant and diverse and I think kind of interesting. So let us move then to what the biblical sources tell us about these activities and technologies. And I'm just going to show a few rather than clog up the slide with lots and lots of text. But from the relatively few attestations that we have in the Hebrew Bible, we know that grinding stones were valuable. So you can see, here for yourself, a few verses that seem to show this. So basically, a desolate settlement is one where there's no sound of millstones grinding away. If you take an upper millstone and a pledge, it would be like taking a life in pledge. It was that valuable. We learned that, of course, upper millstones, handstones can be used as a weapon in this famous case. So, and the fact that it's a woman, who's responsible for using this as a weapon that ultimately, is dropped on a head and a skull is crushed as a result is possibly, is not really ironic, because perhaps she was actually carrying it with her in this particular situation. When we get to other sort of specific examples of the grinding in the Hebrew Bible, we find pretty clearly that women are grinders. There are only 2 biblical references to men and boys grinding. So it's usual for women in a household context, whether it be female slaves or daughters or other family members, mothers, to grind for their families. But then when we get to males grinding, we only have Samson, and then we have this Lamentations 5:13, which shows men and boys basically under duress who are forced to do activities that are outside the norm, and in the case of Samson, certainly emasculating. So the biblical, even though we have many other sources to work from in terms of textual and artistic and archaeological and other things, even if we're just looking at the biblical sources or the biblical descriptions of grinding, it is clear that this is something that's really strongly associated with women. And it's associated with them at home, in the household, domestic context. Baking is pretty much the same, although as we'll see, there's more evidence for male bakers in the biblical text. So here are just some examples of specific women in some cases who are baking in certain situations, like the medium at Endor and also Tamar for Amnon. So there's a lot going on with that, which I'm not going to get into. But basically you mostly have, again, domestic settings, women who are at home, whether it be in the palace or in their house back at Endor. And then you get to this. So we have in several places in Jeremiah, which I'll show, references to women who are baking for the Queen of Heaven. So all the other references that we've looked at so far have been not specifically attached or somehow kind of concerning the veneration of a deity. But here we have this. So what we learn from this particular passage is that children are gathering wood, fathers are kindling the fire, and women are kneading dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. They're pouring out libations. So this is, as far as I understand, this is the only specific ritual event that's mentioned by the biblical authors in which women, men, and children explicitly participated. So the context for this particular activity is the home, the neighborhood, the local community. You've got the whole family working together to pull this off. If we continue on to Jeremiah 44, you can see more specifics about why these cakes were baked for the Queen of Heaven and why libations were poured out for her, whoever she may be. So we learn that our ancestors, our kings and our officials used to do this in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. So it seems like a pretty widespread activity from this particular verse. When the people stopped making offerings to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out libations, they lacked everything, perished by the sword and by famine. The women are doing this with their husband's knowledge. Moving on then to what we know about ritual activity and cult sites in the Iron Age, I want to refer to Albertson Schmidt's recent book here from 2012, where and there have been, of course, many other important studies on this topic, but this recent one has been particularly useful for me, looking at things from a more archaeological perspective because of what information that it contains and their typology, which I'm attempting to use myself. So they analyzed 110 Iron Age archaeological contexts with evidence of cultic activity. And so they created this typology of 8 specific locations, context for this ritual activity. By far the majority, 78 out of 110, are in domestic contexts. They're in houses, basically, or in courtyards attached to houses. And then you have, in contrast, relatively few archaeological examples of cultic activity happening in these other contexts. So some of the things that Alberts and Schmidt have to say, I've just pulled out a couple of quotes here when they're discussing what all of this means, is that first of all they find that the pattern is pretty clear. In most cult sites in the Iron Age Israel, that cultic equipment is found in houses on the ground floor, and it's found in close proximity to food preparation, hearths and ovens especially, and other daily life activities. Hearths and ovens are fixed installations, they don't move. Whereas grinding stones and ceramic vessels move around, of course. So, I mean, looking at ovens and hearths as sort of these fixed installations to help try to understand activity areas is, in some circumstances, much more useful than looking at portable artifacts. They say that the domestic cult was the primary center of the fundamental religious activity and needs of the family. And then, importantly, women played an important role in the ritual activities of everyday life. So now I just want to look a little bit closely at an example of what one of these cultic spaces looks like. So we're not looking at temples and necessarily any distinctive architecture. So we're actually looking more at features and artifacts that are found in association with each other in certain household spaces. So the example that I'm looking at is at Tel Halif in the Negev, which is the best analyzed and published domestic ritual area. So this F7 house, you see the plan here, is a traditional sort of 4-room pillared house with 2 stories. It dates to the 8th century. It was believed to have been destroyed by Sennacherib's campaign at the very tail end of the 8th century. And again, this is a type 1 for Alberts and Schmidt domestic shrine. So I'm not going to go through every room because they excavated it relatively meticulously, and they collected a lot of samples of botanical remains and faunal remains and things so that those things could be looked at more carefully, in addition to doing a really nuanced reconstruction of activity areas using artifacts and installations. But basically, what I want to focus on are these 3 spaces, so parts of room 5 and then rooms 1 and 2. So what we have here, first of all, these 2 red circles are ovens. So we have the remains of an oven that seems to be freestanding in room 5, and then there is another, and that's this one. It's hard to see because it just looks like a lump of clay. And then over here, there is also the remains of an oven that's just inside the entrance to this room. The black oval seems to be the base of a grinding emplacement that's similar to the one I showed you before from Rehov. So in neighboring houses at Halif, there are many examples of similar kinds of emplacements that still have their grinding slabs in situ, and that's this one. So this didn't actually come from this house, it came from a nearby house. I just took the picture when I was there like summer before last, and so there's lots of in situ grinding stones out there. This one happens to be missing its grinding stone, but I believe that's what this was for. And then the green is a mortar made of limestone that's set into the ground. So in addition to these features, we've got lots of storage jars found in room 1, which led James Harden, who studied this house, to conclude that before it was destroyed, this room was used primarily for storage, although earlier in its life history, the room had been used for cooking activities. Over here, you've got the primary kitchen area. And then over here, you have a sort of living room where some specialized kinds of activities were going on. But before getting to that, let's look more closely at room 5, this area. So here's a photo where you can see this possible grinding emplacement. Here's the big old limestone mortar that's set into the floor. This is the oven back here. And then all around there are storage jars, craters, cooking pots, bowls, heavy ash deposits, and various groundstone tools, and then other evidence that is consistent with food preparation. So this led Hardin and the original excavators to call this the primary food processing place in the house, or the kitchen. In contrast, The artifacts that were found just inside the entrance to room 2, which is what you're looking at here in this reconstruction. So there's the entrance and there's that grinding emplacement kind of peeking around the corner. Included 2 finely dressed stone blocks that have been interpreted as altars or stands, a fenestrated or a windowed ceramic stand that might have been used for burning incense, or perhaps offerings were placed on top of it, and then also the head of a Judean pillar figurine, which is one of several that were found in the house, as well as a large variety of ceramic vessels, brownstone tools. There's a little triangular shaped stone here, which doesn't seem to be functional, and therefore may be representing something else. Also, iron arrowheads, lots of other things, as well as grapes, legumes, cereals, fish, and cow bones and sheep bones. So this space was then interpreted, as I said, as a place where food was consumed and sometimes prepared, or in other words, a sort of living room where family members and guests could come together and basically eat. However, you have clustered here on the kind of northern end here of the room, as you can see in this reconstruction, these distinctive cultic artifacts from Alberts and Schmidt's category A. So stands, possible altars, and then also a female figurine that suggest household cultic activities. So given the close proximity of grinding stones, ovens, and the interesting and kind of specialized equipment found in this space, it seems possible to suggest that bread and other grain-based foods were prepared in the adjacent kitchen, and a portion was offered to the deities that were venerated in this house, in this space, which I think notably has no fixed features in it at all. Just things on the floor. So we don't have benches, we don't have hearths, ovens, anything like this. The other example I want to look at briefly is a somewhat different kind of space. So this is coming from Lachish, and this is room 49, which seems to be late 10th century, so I'm jumping around in time, I know, and this has been categorized, well, this has been put into type 3, the neighborhood or village shrine category by Alberts and Schmidt. And what's interesting for me in this image is what it's missing, which is an oven, which is described in the publication, but there's no picture of it and no drawing of it, and it's not indicated on the plan. So this broad room, which is about 2 by 3 meters, has a bench along its inner walls. The western corner of the bench was raised to form a small platform. The distribution of artifacts shows that the cultic focus was oriented toward this corner. This included a horned limestone altar, which is here, 4 stands, 2 of them are fenestrated with the windows cut out that you can see here, and there's 2 others. Pointed bowls with stands, looks kind of like a funnel, this one. They had evidence of burning on them. And other ceramic vessels. 3 chalices were found on the west bench, and then elsewhere in the space we've got 3 cooking pots and 2 clay basins, as well as a fragmentary clay oven, which, as I said before, is not marked on the plans. So we don't know exactly where it is, but from what I understand, it's over more toward this area, so it's not in the focal point of the cult, kind of corner over there, if that's what we want to call this. So Alberts and Schmidt interpret this as a village shrine that may have served for the occasional offering of burnt material or libations associated with ritual meals that were prepared in the cult room itself. By whom is hard to say, because we're not looking at a standalone, we're not looking at a house. We're looking at some other kind of specialized space, it appears, that has other cultic elements attached, adjacent to it, which we're not looking at in this particular image, just to show you some of the published photos of what those stands and the altar and other items look like. So something different is going on here, perhaps, compared to what's going on in household spaces, and so it's hard to know exactly who's doing what in that space, and who's allowed in, who's doing the cooking, etc. Note up here that we have from the reliefs, the Assyrian reliefs, showing the conquest of Lachish by Sennacherib, that some very similar looking vessels are being carried off by the Assyrian soldiers from perhaps another cultic context at this site from slightly later in the Iron Age. back then again to what Alberts and Schmidt have to say about the domestic cult. So based on their analysis of some 80 instances of cultic items like stands and altars and figurines in domestic and related contexts, and the ritual paraphernalia found in these contexts, we can conclude that ritual objects are often assembled and arranged near fireplaces or other facilities associated with the processing and consumption of food on the ground floor. The predominant ritual actions were then libation rites, dry offerings, burning of aromatics, and votive practices, and other ritual actions with human and animal figurines. Then, they also say, and this is something that's been proposed by other scholars, Carol van der Toorn, Carol Myers, Phyllis Bird, and many others through the years, that family religion influenced state religion. And so this is where we now go to male bakers. So I skipped over that before so that I could bring it up sort of, kind of closer to the end, but I want to turn to the examples that we have of verses where we've got specifically male bakers described. So we have Lot, who bakes unleavened bread. And then we have reference to a professional male baker in Egypt, and then also a baker's street that apparently existed in Jerusalem, sometime in the early 6th century. So we have no archaeological evidence for such a baker's street in Jerusalem, and know nothing or very little about commercial baking during the Iron Age in the Levant. But we're assuming that in a baker's street, we've got male bakers who are, doing the actual work in these public commercial areas. But we also have men baking for Yahweh. So the bread of the presence. I just want to suggest here, we've got very late references to this practice. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them are rather late, which refer to the 12 loaves of lechem hapanim that was baked each week. You can see the details here. They were placed in 2 rows or piles with 6 on a table of pure gold in the Tabernacle and also in the Jerusalem temple. We learn about the specific men who were responsible for and in charge of this bread, making the flat cakes specifically. So unleavened, we're assuming. These look more leavened to me, but I just grabbed that off the web. So unleavened bread, and then they were prepared for each Sabbath, and then they're changed out, the following Sabbath, and then the priests are then allowed to eat them. We have no remains of the Jerusalem temple to work with here. So I'm throwing in Ezekiel's vision, where he talks about the priests who are baking the grain offerings in his temple. And the location of this activity is here, in the priest's kitchen, which you can see is adjacent to the temple itself. And so his reason for why these are prepared in this specific area and not in the outer court is so that it will not communicate holiness to the people. We have kitchens located at the other 4 corners where different cooking for different activities was taking place. So the bread that was being baked here, the grain offerings that are being prepared in this priest's kitchen, were being done for Yahweh specifically. Grain that was being perhaps ground and then baked to make bread or other foods in the other kitchens along the corners were being made for the consumption in ritual meals. So I want to suggest maybe that we look at this way, that men toward the end of the Iron Age, let's say, are taking, let's say middle to end of the Iron Age, not to be specific, but maybe from the 8th century on, are taking technologies and practices developed by women in the household context to specialized spaces like bakeries, weaving workshops, and perhaps the temple that primarily served men. And so this is in line with what we know about, most technologies in the early history of the study of, technologies in the Near East, where you've got these, crafts that are being developed in the household context, and then they're commercialized, professionalized, specialized by men in contexts that are primarily serving men, like the temple would have. So What I want to end with here, because I definitely want to leave all time, lots of time for questions, is that we have abundant information about these crucial daily life activities in ancient Israel. Grinding stones, ceramic vessels, clay ovens tend to not go anywhere. They tend to preserve fairly well, and in some cases, for example, in the case of hearths and ovens, they really don't move at all, and so they're there for the studying. From that information, from experiments like reconstructed ovens, ethnographic and ethnoarchaeological research in the region looking at traditional practices like constructing ovens and baking bread, we can then incorporate the biblical text that does describe these practices, but not with a whole lot of detail. And so I am in the process, as are others, of trying to do just this, rather than looking at the Hebrew Bible first as a source of information about these activities in the Iron Age. Instead, looking at how those references can fill in, what we learn from all of the other possible sources of information that we've got. And in the case of grinding stones and clay ovens, we have an embarrassment of riches of those artifacts and installations. So, thank you very much. I am happy to answer any, talk about anything else that people are interested in. There's a lot that I left out, obviously. So
we'll migrate over here.
Okay.
Yeah, that's something.
Well, I have an observation there, I guess, or a question more so about the relationship of earlier traditions in the region to the suggestions that you're making here. Because if I understood you correctly, you're suggesting that the Iron Age practices between 1000 and the contemporaneous operation of the temple precincts in the domestic context informed traditions or introduce them to the cultic context? Is that?
Yes, but I'm also not talking specifically about what's going on in the preceding
periods. Okay, because that's where I was kind of headed. I was thinking in particular of sort of iconic photograph of the mass grinding installations at Ebla circa 2350 BCE, and how that would relate to who was doing that in that context. If I remember correctly, it's in the palatial context, not the temple, but sort of those official state contexts rather than the sort of house raised.
It's a bit of a different world. I mean, so I'm talking about Syria and also Egypt. I mean, it's sort of a kind of different world from what we've got in southern Levant. Although, I mean, I didn't get into this here, but I mean, we do have evidence for in the Middle and Late Bronze Age temples and other cultic spaces. I mean, evidence of similar kinds of practices. So, grinding stones, ovens, vessels that were used for consumption and storage are also found, throughout these spaces. So, I'm suggesting that some of these things are, getting into the Iron Age 1 and what's sort of happening during the formative period when, we kind of got something new, in the highland areas where, maybe we've got, of course, the adoption of some more traditional practices from the region, but also some new things, where there's some, I guess, maybe domestic experiments going on a bit. So there's certainly continuity, but I think there are also some changes during that period that we're seeing early in the cult, especially in the 10th century.
Are there any indications in Bronze Age texts like the Ugarit materials for grinding in cult context or otherwise?
No, really. No.
Okay. Amanda.
Yeah, I mean, I have thought. A lot of people have thoughts about that. I mean, I don't know, but I mean, perhaps Asherah or another deity that was. I originally, when I was thinking about this presentation, I had lots of Asherah, and then I got rid of it all because there's so much, and people really get, I think, distracted by that, or not distracted, but it kind of goes off in a different direction, and I mean, that's a whole thing in and of itself. I even have slides here prepared talking about the Tanakh. called space and weaving and all that sort of stuff too. Another technology that seems to be playing out also in the context of the Jerusalem temple. So could be Asherah, could be another female deity, I don't know.
Yes?
First question, you mentioned that there are biblical citations of both women and eventually men making, and you talk about weaving. Are there any passages that you could cite where there are instances of men doing weaving in the Bible?
Right. Is it explicit when they're talking about the preparation of the textiles for the tabernacle? It's the women who are doing the actual work. I have to look it up. Weaving is the other activity. It was spinning. Spinning and then weaving are also extremely, very strongly associated with women. So I can't think off the top of my head of references to men. I have to look.
And the second question I have is, you talk about the Queen of Heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Who are they referring to there?
Who's the Queen of Heaven?
Could you repeat the question?
Who is the Queen of Heaven mentioned in the biblical
Right.
text?
I don't know who the Queen of Heaven is. It could be Asherah. I mean, a lot of people have have their opinions on who that could be. Astarte, Tirat, some sort of combination, perhaps. I think Susan Ackerman has said in print. So, I mean, there are a lot of possibilities. I think probably, based at least on the biblical evidence and then the rather sparse, inscriptional evidence that we've got, Asherah is probably a pretty good candidate for the Queen of Heaven. From my perspective.
Yes.
Two questions, one directly to your presentation. Which grains were being ground? And the other one is, what is the basis for the precise date of 586 BCE as the end of the Iron Age, and then what?
Right. Okay, so the answer to the second question is right, the destruction of Jerusalem. Right.
So
and
586.
then the exile to Babylon. To the first question, it seems, and this is changing all the time, but I mean, wheat and barley. So emmer and encorn wheat, and then 2 and 6 row barley. But there are other grains that are being grown here as well and processed, and we know this because more and more archaeologists are doing careful collection of botanical samples in the field now that can be studied, and this wasn't done so much in the past. So a lot of it was based on other sources of information rather than direct evidence from archaeological contexts.
Yes, Sarah.
Thank you, Jenny. That was fascinating. I wondered about the standing of the bread and whether anyone has identified any archaeological artifacts that could have been used for that. I think that they stamp bread in the modern Greek Orthodox Church, and you can get these bread stamps. Or are there any impressions from them, perhaps, if they were made of organic materials?
Bread stamps are fascinating because it's a subset of things that I looked at when I was in Jordan, because a lot of people had them in their houses and things from their families, and I actually looked at one woman stamping bread also when I was there. There aren't, as far as I understand, there is an example from Cyprus, and now I'm forgetting the name of the site, where there seems to be a bread mold that's in the shape of a female. Right? Now I'm trying to remember exactly where it came from. I have to dredge that up.
I'm not sure that would be in Larry Stager's book.
Yeah, yes.
The household.
Okay. Yeah, so there's that, but Cyprus. And from the southern Levant, not so much. So what marked with her image means exactly is not clear. Maybe it was marked another way. I don't, it's hard to say. Right, it may not be
Frosting.
a female, kind of figure or frosting, right?
Yes.
In many cultures, grinding goes together with rhythmic songs that all the time pass, sort of a call and a response. And I know that this would be difficult to document, and I'm asking completely naively, are there any indicators that singing or rhythmic call and response took place with grinding?
That's a great question.
That is a great question. Let me repeat that. So the person has asked if there are songs that would go with the grinding, which would be typical to a lot of traditional cultures.
I don't think that there's evidence for that. Not that I can think of. I'm thinking of weaving. as being, that's something that has been studied, the weaving songs. But for grinding specifically, none that I know. And I'm thinking also of Palestinian ethnography that I've read, and like from Dalman on to later times, where there are lots of expressions and superstitions about bread and grinding. Lots and lots. And some of them persist in the region too. It's fascinating. But in terms of specific songs, I can't even think of any references in those. Just a lot of expressions, but not songs. Kind of rhythm kind of thing.
Yes?
I was wondering if there's like any indication of like particular foods that were identified to be specific to offer to like deities, like any specific foods that were specifically offered.
So the question is, are there specific foods that are directed towards particular deities or as part of the...
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, what sources can we look at for that, to answer that question, right? I mean, I would think that in these ritual spaces, especially in houses, then that would be a place to look. But the fact that you've got, the vast majority of cultic spaces in the Iron Age in the same context where people are cooking and eating day to day, it's really difficult to say.
But more than likely then, things
Grain,
that people were eating
yes, exactly.
are also being made to anthropomorphize sense of the deity.
Exactly. And so the staple foods were grains in various forms, occasional meat. These libations could be wine, water, oil, something else, some milk maybe. So it would be really hard to say, unless you had a more specialized cultic context. And we have so few of those in the Iron Age in terms of like temples, you know what I mean? Like Arad and Dan and others, a few other sites where you've got that kind of data to work with.
Sioni.
Why does the house of Tel Khalif have to be a religious cult site or a religious ritual site? I'm just thinking, if anyone who's going to make bread is going to be involved in a ritual activity, it's going to spread out over part of the kitchen. So you will always, and if someone makes bread regularly, you'll expect to find certain utensils, in one corner, somewhere. The only find they have was what they claimed were altars, or just squared blocks, and the head of
the head, and then one stand. Also, which they don't have good pictures of. I mean, there's just a sketch. But yeah, so there was one fenestrated stand from that space, those two blocks, which, could have completely different uses, I don't know. And then the pillar figurine. Right, could be. Yes. There are a couple other things, though, that make me suspicious. Some of the stone objects there, which I haven't seen in person, but I'd like to kind of get a better look at some of these things and see if I can make anything of them. But there's so, as there's so much found in these spaces that are surprising, right? There's evidence for glass slag, metal slag. There's clear evidence for winemaking not in room 2, but in room 5. And so a lot of activities are kind of going on in a very small space. And what I think Jimmy and others, Jimmy especially, is arguing when he's reconstructing this house is that, it's portability. So when these activities are taking place, they may cluster around, these kind of fixed installations where, cooking is happening and that kind of thing, but ultimately you can kind of move around a little bit. There are few cult corners then. I think Jimmy actually in his book calls it a cult corner, but I'm not sure, do you call it a cult? No, right, because Alberts and Schmidt say, no, there are very few of those in domestic context, So
you're not able to pin it down to a specific space in the room. Yep. It's more of a generalized activity associated.
Right, and it's embedded. It's embedded in everyday life. So the idea, kind of going back to like things Carol van der Toorn has written about, girls and women, kind of alongside their, kind of education and learning how to feed and care for family members are also learning how to feed and care for ancestors and household deities, by baking bread and pouring libations or whatever. So the idea is that maybe a portion of what foods everyone in the family is eating that particular day maybe gets set aside somewhere. But maybe that being set aside doesn't have to necessarily be a specific fixed altar or something like that. It can move around, maybe depending on how the space is being used that day.
Along a related line, is there any indication that the transformative process of turning what is grain, something that looks so different, into a completely different, this would be about the closest thing you get to like, I don't know, plastics, you know, making something completely out of nothing, out of chemicals. Is there any indication that transforming the food in such a way had some magical connotations or perception? Do we have ethnographic data for that?
Yeah, I mean, Carol Myers has written more on this than anyone. I mean, sort of that very thing, this sort of transformational act where you're turning, you know, this valuable product into something, you know, edible, and all the steps that are required and the specialized technologies and knowledge in order to get there. I mean, this is not easy to do, and it's extremely time consuming, and, you know, it requires a lot of tools, technology, and time. So, I mean, we're so far removed, I think, from this, you know, of course, these kinds of activities ourselves. You know, I am for sure, even though I bake sometimes. But, you know, going to, you know, doing this ethnographic study in Jordan and seeing, you know, women who are baking, you know, kind of in this traditional way, just the time and effort that goes into this, and the preference for certain types of bread and certain, you know, kind of, the standards are high. And they're very specific. And so there's a lot more to this than I have ever imagined there would be. So I'm sure there is an element of, you know, kind of, you know, people being impressed by this transformation, you know, that happens, you know, from grain to fluffy white bread, you know, out of a tannour or whatever, which is the most delicious thing on earth, basically, when it's fresh.
Yeah, and
I mean, after a week, I can't imagine what that was about. But, you know, just sitting on the table for a week.
It didn't sit around, I doubt it.
Right, exactly.
And you could make it into whatever shapes you wanted to. I mean, that's the thing, and you don't really need molds for it per se. You could make gingerbread men-looking things without molds, right? Yes, in the very far back.
You mentioned even contemporary context, women in Jordan who stamp their bread. Could you say how that's done and what that looks like?
Yeah, so there's actually, you know, it's here. I was like, I know it's in one of these pictures. That's the stamp. So the way that the stamp is used is that it's made out of clay or stone, and the women that I studied at least made it themselves. And rather than being a stamp like this, it's a mold like this. So the thing sits, and then they take the bread, like the dough ball, and spread it out on top of it, kind of impress it, and then somehow very deftly pick it up and then slap it in the oven without ruining the design.
So it's a design of what?
Lines, you know, it's geometric stuff. I mean, and kind of, you know, since I didn't get into it, I didn't get into this enough. But I mean, when we did ask those who were using them, you know, what the story is with these things, where they came from, what they mean. I mean, these are, you know, meant to look pretty, or in the way that my mother did, kind of answers. So, yeah.
Yes?
Remember you mentioned that grinding, or the act of grinding, seems to be only associated with women, and whenever men were mentioned in the Bible to be towards grinding, was always in like some sort of demeaning manner, like Samson getting his eyes pulled out. Was there some sort of like, the writers had some sort of bias against it, or is there like some sort of social stigma for grinding, or?
I think, well, I mean, what others have mostly said, I mean, is that, this is sort of contra to what Carol Myers has written a lot about, is that, these are horrible things to do, right? I mean, grinding on a millstone like this, you know, creating enough flour that's fine enough to make into the things that you want to make, bread, for example, you know, for all, you know, members of your extended family, let's say, can literally be hours a day of work. And it leaves, you know, there's skeletal muscular stresses and things that have been identified in certain, you know, cemetery populations, especially like Neolithic Levant. There are examples of studies like this. So, I mean, it really does, you know, does harm, right? I mean, this is repetitive stress injury sort of things. We know, for example, in, you know, Egypt with the servant statues, which are almost all women, you know, that this was a fairly low-class kind of servant status kind of activity. You know, those who could afford it, women who could afford it, had other people do that kind of work for them, you know, before commercial bakeries and you know, other places existed. So I imagine that it was just about, you know, one of the worst possible jobs. I mean, Carol Myers has said a lot about, you know, in her articles and books about how, you know, this brings, you know, women's status and people, you know, kind of value their economic contributions to the household with their, you know, kind of commitment to these really time-consuming food preparation practices. And I hope that that's true, but you know, it's the worst, really. You know, so I mean, I'm sure anyone who could get away with not doing it didn't do it, and you know, certainly men could do that, it seems. And there's nothing that says that male priests ground anything. I mean, they baked, they prepared, they, you know, organized, whatever, but they didn't bake, they didn't grind.
general question, but how do you know which areas to excavate?
How do you know which areas to excavate? Like within a site or within a particular?
Well, it depends. Like, do you go to a certain site and be like, oh, this area, I'm just gonna like excavate?
How do you choose? How do you choose an excavation?
No, that's a
Well,
great question.
Maybe let's narrow it a little bit more. How would you look for a domestic context to find the kinds of things
Right.
you're interested in?
That really depends on the time period, I think, right? I mean, with Jezreel is kind of, that's not what we've got. We've got mostly earlier, we don't have so much Iron Age material where we're working, and we haven't found a whole lot of domestic. So, I mean, sometimes you kind of get lucky. In places like Halif and other sites where you have a history of excavations, you know, various projects that have been carrying on for, you know, decades or whatever, where they have exposed, you know, some, you know, bits of houses or a complete house here and a fragment of one there, then I think going back and excavating using new techniques and being more careful about, you know, kind of what you're collecting and how is a great approach. It's very slow.
Yeah.
All of this is really, really slow. So, I mean, in the case of like the F7 house, you know, I mean, this is years of work. The other houses at Halif also are being excavated over the course of seasons. And, you know, it's just...
The short answer is that once you excavate it from the surface and you can characterize an area as either domestic or cult or palatial, you tend to have a conservatism in location and real estate within a site. So upwind is always the nicest place to be.
Yeah.
Most of what we're looking at would be downwind somewhere in the lower town or the sort of domestic quarters. Sarah, yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I was thinking also when you're talking about the Egyptians, about the Hittites who had hundreds of different kinds of breads and over 1,000 gods, and the ritual texts are just filled, and then they must have been baking day and night and sending loaves all over the place to all these different sacred sites. And of course that disappears pretty much after you see, but I wondered if any of that survived, at least in the northern Levant. And that brings me to your final point, which is that when this becomes a big, serious sort of temple level, state level activity, it does become the work of men, at least the baking part. And there's good, I think, comparative evidence for that in Mesoamerica and also in the Andes, that weaving and cooking are domestic activities until it's time for a major state level production, and we sort of get the Oluson factories and things like that, and then they're run by men. But it's nice to pinpoint that the really hard part of it, the grinding, is probably still performed by women.
Right, and if that is the case, that women are actually grinding grain to make the bread for the temple, you know, who are these women, and where are they, and where is this happening, and are they priest wives, are they, you know, who are they? I mean, that opens up a whole new...
The direction of your question, though, I mean, I think that in many cases we would argue that these are, and I think in the Near East we can drum up a few parallels, war captives. That this is a way in which you subject war captives to this kind of activity, and that Samson's treatment there is basically like that. Even though he is specifically a single guy, he's treated like a captive of war.
And he's grinding, he's not turning a mill. I mean, sometimes it's translated that way, but that technology didn't exist. So, I mean, when he was grinding on those kind of, that was the idea, he was grinding on these stones. So, laborious. And he was blonde.
Way back there, yeah.
Is there any beginning date for the braided challah? Any historical?
Yeah, but I don't have that.
Was it?
But it's not.
We wouldn't know for sure in the biblical period.
No, there's no way to know from the biblical period. I mean, I'm thinking kind of more, you know, the last few hundred years, and I don't know. Sorry. Because it's not really a Middle Eastern tradition.
Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, one more. Getting back to the title of our talk, Feeding the Gods. It seemed like we didn't really talk a lot about what they really fed the gods, or which grains, or which breads, or whatever.
Yeah. And which gods?
Touched on it briefly, but
Yeah.
is there any, do we really know anything, or is it subjective?
Well, it's built largely upon those references that Jennie highlighted. That, you know, we get glancing references, but it's not as if we get a clear articulation of the entire mechanism with the treatment of these other cultures.
I mean, we have the specifics, what Yahweh was fed. That we know. I mean, well, that's what we've got, to work with. So, I mean, we know that he needed these 12 loaves a week. And we know it was unleavened bread, finest flour, exactly what that means, I'm not sure. And and little else besides that. I mean, we know about, kind of meat offerings and other things as well, but I mean, in terms of the actual specifics on the bread, and grain, kind of grains that he required, it's just those passages is all we've got to work with, really.
Finest flour. No doubt there were ranges of grinding of quality, right? We're never really to imagine like a room filled with white powder that someone's grinding so much that there's flour flying everywhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the flour also is not the kind of processed white flour that we have in mind either. Not like that.
Okay, maybe one last question back there. Yeah?
Hi. I was curious if you had any insights on the transition from sacrificing people or valuable livestock to sacrificing bread and things of, I don't want to say, I will say less significance, less importance.
So you're suggesting in your question that there's a transition between the sacrifices of meat offerings or
surely at some point,
versus
perhaps not in the described centuries, but there must be some kind of transition from offering people to offering bread.
Well, maybe we'll leave the human sacrifices to aside just because it's not so much in evidence in Israel.
Yeah.
But basically, it's not so much a transition that we're seeing between going from one type of offering to another, but rather a spectrum, right?
I think so, and what was available to. I mean, because what's available to most people to offer up, on an everyday basis is going to be their staple foods that, they can store easily and they produce, in their lives or whatever, and are eating it regularly, So, I mean, we don't think that meat was consumed every day by most people who lived in ancient Israel. It was probably more, kind of rare than that. So I think that we're looking at two different things. I mean, kind of what, not only the symbolism there, but I mean also the ability for people to really afford that kind of thing, kind of meat offerings as opposed to the much more readily available, kind of bread offerings and grain-related offerings. They had it on hand all the time. I mean, basically, it was their staff of life and all of this, whereas meat wasn't. And also, I mean, we have more, kind of references to, the kind of these specific activities happening in the context of the Tabernacle and the Jerusalem Temple, and not evidence that they're slaughtering animals routinely in these domestic ritual contexts. I mean, that is not something that you see in the patterns from what I can tell. So, I mean, they may be offering a bit of whatever they're eating, but it's not like they're, slaughtering specific animals and laying it on that stone block or whatever in the room.
Yeah, the consumption of meat is a fairly limited thing in the ancient world. I mean, in terms of frequency, usually associated with festivals, which would involve a cultic component,
right.
And you could call it a kind of trickle-down diet, right? I mean, something, everything's produced in the cultic context and very often shared out as part of a bigger thing. Okay, I think we'll stop there, but those of you who would like to ask more questions can speak with the speaker afterwards. I want to thank Professor Ebeling again for joining us.
Thank you all.